Babel went from this thing that was supposed to be, that used to be called 6 to 5, and I have a really old blog post about it in 2014. It used to be this thing that you could just write the next version of JavaScript, but then it became a super modular JavaScript kind of parser, lexer, / language transpiler. It's really a compiler. And I think Henry's going to talk to us today about using the new babel-preset-env, which should allow us to stop having to play plugin wars with our Babel environments. If you've ever had to struggle with that and Webpack, then you're fucking stoked on this shit. Give it up for Henry.
All right, so I'm going to start off with this tweet. Yeah, this talk is going to be about Babel, configuration, JavaScript. Yeah, so this is going to be the future of Babel with babel-preset-env. So I'm going to be talking about JavaScript fatigue. And this is more of an example of how a project can evolve to, figure out the problems with configuration, and maybe the behind the scenes of like how we thought about fixing some of these issues. Dan Abramov, he made a nice video a while ago talking about how in JavaScript there's all these different tools, they don't work together, and it's really hard to use them unless you're the maintainers. So right now I want to talk about something we made to make it a little bit easier to work with Babel in the future. So I'm going to talk about the problem, what the progression of thought was to lead up to this, this project, and then the future of Babel. So I'm Henry Zhu. My Twitter account is leftpad, and my GitHub is hzhu. I work at Behance, at Adobe in New York, and I help maintain Babel. And if people don't know, it's a compiler for JavaScript, helps you write ES6 and other features, and moves it down to ES5. And just some stats. In the last year, we've increased our number of contributors from about 200 to 400 contributors. We've increased the number of downloads we've had to the main package from 4.5 million downloads a month to about 11 million downloads a month. Our Slack group has 7,500 users. And now we also have plugins, so you can make your own Babel transforms that do things that you need, and there's about 2,000 of those. And one way people think about Babel, they know about Babel, is through these things called presets. And so, it's funny because a lot of people are like, oh, I don't need Babel anymore because all the browsers are going to support it in the future, support ES6 already. But what happens is we're going to have new things coming up in the future. And I think if you were someone that wanted to use ES6 in the first place, you're probably going to want to use stage 0, right? So I'm going to talk about fatigue. What do we do to combat fatigue as a maintainer of a project? Do we just ask the users to read the docs? That we just ask them to figure it out by themselves? Or do I have to go on Twitter and Slack and GitHub and just keep answering the same thing over and over? Maybe instead of taking the time to answer the same thing multiple times, we need to figure out a way so that this question doesn't even be asked at all anymore, because the tool can do it for you automatically. So sometimes just adding docs isn't enough. Maybe there's something we can do in the code as programmers to make it easier for users. This was a tweet from this Twitter account yesterday. Just, I guess, trying to make fun of how Babel, is really hard to use. So I responded because this account made basically the same tweet last year. I guess the person felt bad. I gave a talk a few weeks ago about this topic, about maintainer burnout and how to deal with it, and how we can combat that as a community. But here I'm going to be talking about just Babel specifically. So the real first problem that we have is what we're going to do about ES20XX, after 2015, 16, on and on. Babel used to be called 6 to 5, as Brian said, because literally all it did was take ES6 and turn it into ES5. But eventually, our most commented on issue is the name change for what it should be called after 6 to 5 should be something else. Because maybe it's called 7 to 5 and 8 to 5, so having a number in the name doesn't really make sense. And we decided to pick Babel. And if you've used Babel before, the way you have to configure it, so in this case, it's just a JSON file, and you pass in a preset. A preset is just like an array or a set of plugins. In this case, we're trying to compile ES 2015. And so this config option actually means including all these different individual plugins. Each syntax is an independent NPM package. So there's one for like arrow functions and classes and all these things. But if you use this config option, it actually means you're enabling all these different plugins. So what happens in 2016? Well, now we got to add another string to this array. But then what happens in the future? We're going to, assuming that we're all going to be still using JavaScript in 2020 and beyond, but that's going to be pretty verbose, right? So then I was thinking, well, maybe we should just make a preset that just combines all those together in one thing. And that's where we came up with this idea of preset latest. And that was pretty good for a while. So the second problem was preset options. The problem with having an open source project that's really that's used a lot is that you're going to have a lot of people asking for certain things. Why is the output so big? Why does it have to follow the spec so much? Because I don't care about the spec. Or the opposite, when I go to TC39 and they ask me, why is it not following the spec? And then people are like, oh, how do I turn it off? Just all these different things, and you have to figure out how to manage this in a project. And the result of this is you can make your own presets if you want for your own needs. And so people would make things like ES 2015 loose or ES 2000 loose or Node 5, and then you're just like, wait, now there's like a 2016 loose modules Webpack. Like it just gets longer and longer, and people would just keep reporting things like that. So basically, we came up with the idea that you should be able to pass options to presets. Then you could have one official preset, and no one would have to make their own. So if there is this preset called loose modules, then we basically pass in an options object so that you can turn on loose mode or modules when you need to. And so that wasn't a thing for a really long time. But now that's here, it solves a lot of the issues we had with just all these different proliferation of presets that didn't need to be there. But what's missing? So evergreen browsers. So these are browsers that are automatically updating without you having to install something new. So what happens is if you're using a newer version of a browser, like Chrome, and it supports arrow functions, then you might need to make a preset that's literally just preset without arrow functions. And maybe every time a new browser supports a new feature, you have to remove one of those individual plugins so it doesn't compile it anymore. And so that sucks because then you have to keep track of what syntax is in what browser. At the same time, the language is improving, right? Every year there's going to be a new version, a new syntax, so then we have to also update this configuration when there's a new yearly language. And also for ourselves, the target environment changes. That means when we decide as a company or as a project to drop IE 11 or something like that, then you also have to change your config to not compile the syntax that was needed before. So these are all just changes that we all have to make, and there's this sliding window of your target environment, language, and what Babel supports and the browser support. So of course, what can we do? We can try to automate this. So basically, there was a lot of discussion about this kind of thing, and the idea is, I don't know if anyone has used auto prefixer before, just raise a hand. Okay, so basically it's a way to, auto prefix -WebKit, those kinds of things for CSS, and so this is the same idea for JavaScript syntax. There's actually been a lot of issues. I just searched through the issues on the Babel GitHub tracker on people wanting this kind of thing, being able to not use certain plugins so that it runs native syntax. And so the first one was in December 2014, and Babel was created September 28th, 2014. So that was like only a few months later. So and Babel turned 3 just a few weeks ago. So this is something people have been wanting a long time, but we never thought this would be like something we would want to do, because like, how do you maintain this giant like Excel sheet of like what transforms you need? So now I'm going to talk about babel-preset-env. So env stands for environment. And we're using this table called the Compatibility Table. I think it was referenced before, but basically it's a spreadsheet of every browser version and which individual syntax it supports. So right now, you probably can't tell, but the first column is the current browser. So like if I'm running Chrome right now, it says it's like 97% supported. But before, obviously, like a year ago or 2 years ago, it was like 50, or you don't really know. And you shouldn't have to know, right? So this tool is supposed to help you not have to think about any of that stuff. The only problem with this is that like someone has to maintain this table too. And it kind of is unreasonable to expect like me or some other person just to like update it for every single browser. So I appreciate help from the community on that. So just to go in more detail, to zoom in. So yeah, there's different individual tests that it runs to figure out what browsers support what feature. So the way this preset works, what we do is we maintain a mapping between the browser itself and the individual plugin. So in this case, there's like an arrow function plugin, and then we map like, oh, the first version of Chrome that supported arrow functions was 47. So then we can figure out if you're only targeting like Chrome 47, then we don't have to compile. And then secondly, we have to map the rows in that table with the actual plugins. And then eventually come up with like an options or a syntax to make this work. So in this case right here, we have this new option called targets, and you can pass in the browsers that you're supporting. So if you're saying like I need to support Safari 7, then it'll compile against that target. And you can change that to like IE or mobile browsers, anything you need. So, and another problem is people were confused about how the targets worked, but actually if you use env without any options at all, it does the same exact thing as if you just made 2015, 16, 17. So if you're already using just preset 2015, just change the ES 2015 to env, and everything will work the same. So I'm going to go into some examples of what this actually means. So if you're going to target Safari 7, it doesn't support classes. So on the left side, there's an export class. And so because Safari doesn't support classes, it will compile the class into a function. And it doesn't support, let's see, OK. And then in Chrome, say a later version of Chrome that does support classes, then it won't actually change the class into a function anymore. The class stays the same. But it does convert the export class because it doesn't support modules yet. But if you use modules false, if you want to use like Webpack or something, then it will basically output the same exact code. A really cool feature that we have is being able to target non-browser environments. So if you're using Electron or Node, you can say like Node 6 or Node 8 and then target against that. But even cooler is we have a shorthand for like the version of Node that you're running on your computer. So like if you're in development mode, then you can just target, like if you're running Node 8 on your own computer, you can just do node current, and it runs process version.node, returns 8, and then it will compile a lot less. So we actually do this in Babel itself. So you can write some kind of JS like this where it checks if it's in development mode and then set it to current instead of compiling all the way down to something else. And so after that, like having this feature lets us send native code instead of transpiled code to the browser. And this is important because then you can ship less code. And after I made the first release of preset-env, Kayan, he works at Facebook, and he was asking about whether this idea could work with polyfills. So this is really interesting because Babel is a compiler. It takes syntax and turns into other syntax. It doesn't do anything with polyfillable things like promise or simple, stuff like that. And so he had this idea where, what if we turn the require statement of the polyfill into individual require statements? It's kind of crazy, but I thought that would be a really interesting idea. So yeah, what do we do about polyfills? How do we map all the things to polyfills? So I made a work in progress. Basically, do the same exact thing. You take every single polyfillable thing, uint array and promise and all these things, and you map them to what browsers support what. And so we have this new option in preset-env called entry. So normally when you want to use a polyfill, you have to import it at the first file that runs at the top of the file so that everything else after it has the polyfill available. So all it does is it finds this statement, import polyfill, and then it runs through all the mapping to figure out which individual polyfills are needed. So like say you're doing on the latest Chrome, and maybe it doesn't support pad and pad start, but it supports everything else, then it won't import the whole polyfill, because that could be huge. So Babel, it used to be 6 to 5, right? It converted ES6 to ES5, but now it converts everything above ES6 to ES5, and then with preset-env, we can change both parameters. It can compile anything in ES6 and above to something that's native. So now the future. One thing that we have in the version 2 of this preset is support for a browsers list. It's the same configuration used for auto prefixer. So that way you can have one config file that works for both tools, and you don't have to inline the browser support in the preset itself, which is really cool. And this is really cool. So there's a new option called usage. And what it does is, instead of importing the whole polyfill, you might, even if it's not the polyfill itself is supported, you might not actually use that syntax at all. So say we imported pad left, but you never even, or pad start, but you never use pad start in your code, then there's no reason to import it in the first place. So what this does is it basically runs through every file in your code base, tries to find when you're using a certain syntax, and then adds that import to the top of each file. So say in AJS, we are using promise, and we know that's like a global. So then what we can do is add an import statement for promise. And if we're using something like Webpack, it's not going to import promise like multiple times. So it's fine if import is at the top of like every file. But if you're not using like symbol and it's not supported, then it won't include it at all. So one way of showing that is just like, here are all these different ways of using a polyfillable thing, and then it'll add all the import statements individually. So yeah, basically the point of this is just how can we minimize the amount of code that we can send based on the environment information. And then something we haven't done yet, but something I want to do is make a performance-based table. So instead of like this supported table, we would have to basically hook up the benchmarks for each syntax with preset-env, so that if you're, even if say Chrome supported arrow functions, but they're slower than Babel, then it would know you can have an option of not always compiling anyway because it's faster, and then automatically like turning it off when that's okay to do. The next thing, this is not related to preset-env, but we've been talking about TypeScript a lot. We actually, I guess, been working with the Microsoft team. They made a few PRs to allow TypeScript support in Babel. And all this means, it doesn't mean like Babel is going to start type checking. It's the same as how you would use Flow, which is Facebook's type checker. It allows you to use Babel as a compiler and then TypeScript as the type checker only. So basically, this preset will strip the types, and then Babel will compile everything else. And then TypeScript is more of like the type checker / linter. And this is going to be in the 7.0 release. And the way it basically works is like there's a no emit flag that lets TypeScript just do the checking. Yeah. Another thing that we're always working on is just new proposals. So TC39 is the committee that makes JavaScript, and we're the only, I guess, project or tool that is willing to work on proposals before they reach a certain level. There are no other tools that are going to do that because these proposals might go away and then no one wants to support that. So it's kind of our, I guess, job in a way to implement these things when they're stage 0 or 1 or 2, and then get feedback from you, the community, to figure out if this is a good idea in the first place. And so yeah, so one thing we want to do in the future is attend TC39, and it's a meeting that occurs every 2 months around the world, and you have to pay for it. So I think the people that are on the project, it's like, how do we even get them to go there in the first place? Like, either you get your company to get you to go, or you have to raise some kind of funding. And so we have an open collective where people can sponsor so we can send people over.
What is TC39?
Yeah, TC39 is the committee, technical committee 39, and they create the specification for JavaScript itself. And so Babel is kind of a big part of that, because when they're coming up with ideas, how do they know it's a good idea other than just like in their head or they're talking about it? It's like, how do we get that in the real world without like making the mistake of it lands in browsers and then everyone here is like, this is a bad idea, and then we just wasted all of our time because they had to spend lots of money trying to implement this stuff. So if we can implement it in Babel first, people are using it, they give feedback, then we have a better idea this is good at all. So the first meeting I attended was in May, and the only reason why I got to go was because it was in New York. So I just like walked over and I did a little presentation on Babel. And so yeah, my main point is that Babel is not a company. People, they come up to me, they're like, hey, you work at Babel, or you work at like Facebook, stuff like that. It's like, no, most people that work on Babel are volunteers. Right now, I get to work on Babel at Behance about 50% of my time, and then Justin, he works at Google, and he's working 20% of the time. That means we're the only 2 people working about in any, I guess, funded, sponsored capacity. Everyone else is volunteers, even though a lot of people are using this project. And you can see that we can use tools to figure out who's using this. It's like there's BigQuery, which runs through every website in the HTTP archive, and looks like there's 100,000 websites using Babel just by trying to check this string. So I guess the plea is, let's try to fight against the tragedy of the commons, where we're asking volunteers to support a project that we're all using, but no one wants to sponsor or give back because it seems like the project's doing really well when it's just a handful of people. So yeah, partner with us. Thanks.